A loud shattering sound caught their attention, followed by screaming. "Oh, what now?" Kraft growled, hitting the pedal under his counter to unseal the deadbolt to the door. Stomping across the room, he poked his head out the front door. Almost immediately, he had to duck back in to avoid a stream of sickly pink acid from splattering him in the face. "Christ in a handbasket!" he shouted, yanking the door shut. A moment later, a bestial black shadow slammed against the door, dark violet scales glistening through the slotted glass window. Inquisitive, the beast pulled back from the door and eyed the barrier carefully before snapping its jaws around the handle and tugging with a vengeance. Wood cracking against the frame, Kraft pulled against it with his meager strength, the muscles in his arms straining. Why, oh why, did he let Terrenth talk him into the easy-to-enter two-way door idea? "Rhine!" he shouted behind him. "Behind the counter, there's a pedal on the floor. Hit it!" The girl floundered for a second, staring in horror at the wyvern. Then, finding her footing, she scrambled around back and hit the pedal, locking the door in place completely. Kraft stumbled back, palms rubbed raw, and the early prickles of sweat were beading on his brow. The black wyvern looked different. No, injured would be more accurate, and healed even more so. Scars littered its body. Welts textured the wing membrane from tip to shoulder, and the tail was... This was one of the wyverns that Kraft and Nirf had encountered between Basal and Almara, the very same wyverns he'd blown up. And now one was scrabbling at the door to his shop and chipping the window with its pointed snout. But that was months ago! Were they really smart enough, petty enough, to heal up and track them? Running to the counter, he reached beneath it, gripping the metal rod firmly affixed to the bottom. With a solid yank, it fell free from a pair of clasps, as did the pouch hanging beside it. "Okay, you bastards," Kraft growled, pulling down on the lever protruding below the rod. A small hammer popped out of the rear end of the bar, and a metal casing slotted into place from somewhere inside the device. "I was being nice letting you live the last time." The wyvern at the door backed up, its throat undulating like a worm wriggling into wet earth. After a moment of pause, its mouth opened and a spew of noxious pink liquid coated the door. Immediately, the wood began to warp and warble, and the inset glass dissolved like cotton candy in the rain. Kraft slammed the lever home. "But now, you owe me a goddamn door!" He raised the pipe, aimed, and squeezed the trigger. Fire and smoke and shrapnel exploded from the shotgun's barrel, blasting through the weakened wood and out into the wyvern's face. It reeled back, neck whipping around, sprinkling droplets of blue blood where it stepped. With a casual wave of his hand, Kraft deconstructed the door's corpse, turning the wood into a pile of neatly stacked blocks and a tiny pane of glass. The remaining acid fell to the floor in a congealed dollop of gunk, joining a growing pool of spit that trailed out to where the wyvern recoiled. He stepped over the pastel slime and racked the lever again, sending the spent shell twirling away and locking a fresh one home. He aimed again and fired, catching it in the neck this time and taking out an entire chunk of reptilian flesh. Sparks danced where the remaining buckshot skidded off the creature's hardened scales. The wyvern hobbled sideways with its neck no longer writhing nearly as much. Racking another shell, Kraft aimed for the second wound and fired. A deafening blast and a sickening squelch reverberated around the street as the creature's neck was severed clean in two. The body collapsed into a heap while the head and remaining neck bounced along the cobbled path, wriggling in defiance for only a few more seconds before stilling completely. Kraft opened the lever again and reached into the pouch, pulling 3 replacement shells free to reload the gun. He hadn't really wanted to pull this out, at least not so soon. Eshion had firearms, he'd learned that much, but they were clearly still in the flintlock era and he wasn't quite sure what introducing modern firearm technology into circulation would do. So, he made a personal promise to keep the weapons to himself and only ever use them in an emergency. On top of that, he settled on one of the oldest repeater designs he could remember from his time watching the History Channel, just in case someone managed to smuggle it out of his hands. So, a lever action it was. Kraft slammed the lever home and kept mental count on the 6 rounds he had in the gun's magazine. He'd have to pick up those expended shells later. It was important to reuse material where he could to cut costs. The street curved up from his shop, towards the town center where most of the celebrations were supposed to happen. Dark shapes flickered over it in the early morning sun. "Bastards suck at this whole revenge thing," he muttered. "The festival!" Kraft turned to find Rhine running up beside him, her face oddly calm considering they'd almost been melted. He raised his brow at her. "The festival! You claim to have seen these wyverns before, but all dragons like golden gems. It must be the festival that must have attracted them, not you," she hypothesized. Kraft started forward up the road, with the shotgun's butt dug well into his shoulder. His anger towards the wyvern slowly drained as he considered her words. He sighed. "I don't know. Maybe they're here for me, maybe it's the shiny stuff, maybe both or neither. But they're tearing up my town, and I'm not sitting down for that." Even as he said it, he could feel a tremble enter his hands. Had that been there before? Doing his best to ignore it, he looked to Ryan. You get back to the shop, go up the stairs and close the door. It's solid steel, it should hold them off if they come up there. I have no plans to hide, I can defend myself just fine, she huffed, picking up pace beside him. Though I have to say, for a craftsman you demonstrate an adeptness at defending yourself. Only word of firearms has ever reached me, and never of such a make. Such precision and speed is incredible. It occurred to him briefly that he'd use both the gun and his arm in front of her, a representative of the Crafters Guild who had come to investigate him. Unavoidable, said his mind, racing through every other option he had at the time. Gritting his teeth, he resolved to live with the consequences of that snap decision and prayed they wouldn't be too severe. It's an original, and no, you can't have one, Kraft said, kicking to a small jog. They were nearing the center when another shadow engulfed them. Kraft dove to the ground just as a wyvern swooped in to slash him with its claws, the talons narrowly scraping the back of his shirt. He rolled and brought his gun to bear just in time to fire a shot at its torso. The blast hung to the right, meeting the creature's shoulder blade and taking its wing off entirely. The wyvern spiraled from the sky, slamming into a nearby rooftop before rolling to the streets in a bloody mess. Struggling to his feet, he wiped his brow, a slew of curses rolling off his tongue. That had been close, and it took considerable effort to keep his hand steady. Closing his eyes, he sucked in a breath and let it out, trying to calm himself. He couldn't let shaky hands compromise his ability to aim. He'd certainly gotten stronger during his time in Tomoloda, but that didn't mean he was keen on exercise or had much endurance to match. He already felt winded. A hand fell to his back, warm skin meeting his. He could feel, barely, a place where the talons had nicked him and carved a surprisingly large scratch. Just as the pain was starting to seep in, it vanished, a warm tingling from the hand, washing it away. Are you alright? Ryan asked, helping him stand. Yeah. You do magic? She smiled. I'm a Marvot cleric. Another flag, but this one was different. It didn't feel like it was malicious. To be truthful, none of the flags felt that way. Just that there was more she wasn't elaborating on. Kraft glared at the three remaining shapes circling the skies. A little strange for a craftswoman to be a cleric, isn't it? She matched his gaze, keeping an eye up high. For Lord Marveteer, maybe, but there are plenty from the guild that come from the Church of Chloris Vo. Chloris Vo. The god of creation? He was still fuzzy on Hakaj's religions, but that'd add up if he was right. They drew closer to the square, tossed carts and scattered coin littering the cobblestone. Pink slime oozed in pools, but luckily there hadn't seemed to be any casualties yet. Well, deaths. Someone's leg rested nearby, and a smear of blood led back to a storefront where a collection of people huddled just beyond the window. He could help fix the things that got damaged, but people were out of his league. Even if he could, and that was a rather big if since he wasn't keen to experiment that far, the moral ramifications for it or what it would do to a person didn't sit well with him. Best he could probably do were prosthetics after the fact. Either way, he was powerless to help tend to the wounded until this was all over, and that only pissed him off more than he already was. Well, do you have any spells that can kill these things? He asked, loading another shell into his gun. Some. I prefer to be creative over brutish. Well then, he said, closing the bolt. Get creative. The wyverns finally noticed them and began to dive, in a sequence that spoke of some level of coordination. Ryan stepped forward and stared the wyverns down, the caustic words of an arcane tongue slipping from her lips. In a heartbeat, the middle wyvern's dive turned sharp, slamming straight into the side of the lead. The two turned into a tangled ball of fury and claws that crashed into a collection of stalls, obscuring Kraft's view of the brawl. Ryan popped forward, dashing off towards the dueling dragons. I'll keep these two fighting each other. Take care of the last one. Easier said than done, Kraft growled, aiming his gun to the clouds. He winced. The sun was still low in the sky, at just the perfect angle to make it too painful to aim. He'd barely gotten a bead on the rear wyvern until the damn thing was right on top of him. Firing at the same time, the buckshot passed the creature's bile and vice versa. Kraft screamed as acid singed into his shoulder, his aim on the wyvern dropping. The creature slammed into him with a single talon, the matching pair having been shredded by buckshot. As revenge, it dug into the burning wound, squeezing at skin that began to peel like wet wallpaper. Falling to the ground, the beast tried to lift him with its remaining leg, albeit fruitlessly. Its wings battered the air around them, the dull thrum they produced slamming into his ears and vibrating his vision. Kraft flailed back against the onslaught, fist and gun slamming fruitlessly into the scales while the talons sunk deeper. Pain bled away the panic, adrenaline-fueled clarity left in its wake. Unable to reach the shotgun with both hands, he flexed his fingers in a vain attempt to work the lever. The wrought steel slipped under his nails, but with so little leverage it refused to budge. Biting down on the pain in his shoulder as best he could, he slammed the wyvern with his left arm. The creature didn't budge, and in fact, its claws tightened, making Kraft bite into his lip. He should have gone with a double action or a semi-automatic. Why did he have to go for a lever action? Then, with the wyvern pulling harder and harder into his arm, he noticed the remains of its other claw floating just above his torso. He couldn't. No. Desperate, he lifted his shotgun and slammed the lever handle over the stump. The wyvern flinched, jerking its talon backwards, with just enough force to open the chamber and expel the empty shell. Seeing his opportunity, Kraft jammed the gun into the talon a second time, closing the slide, and loading a fresh shell. Now armed, he angled it as best he could into the thing's chest. A second later, a single pull of the trigger ended its life. The wyvern collapsed against him, milky blue blood seeping into his clothes and cooling the acid on his chest. With a groan, he rolled it aside and stood, pulling the claws free from his shoulder. He had just gotten to his feet when he heard a cry from afar. "Kraft, watch out! I can't stop it!" Kraft spun to see Ryan waving at him frantically as the last wyvern, now much worse for wear with its sopping wounds, soared right towards him. Its maw was open wide, and its teeth itching for a bite.